is the business of Africa. If it's about Africa, then it's our business. Hello and welcome to the inaugural episode of the Business of Africa, where we aim to bring big and small business issues right to your doorstep. In this episode, we're going to be talking about the informal economy. When those words are mentioned, what exactly does it mean to you? What kind of feeling does it conjure up? Why is it important? And we take a look at its contribution to economic growth in some parts of the continent. To help us do exactly that, we speak to Laura Alphas, International Coordinator at Women in Informal Employment, Globalization and Organization, also known as WIEGO, as well as Dr. Ruth Castell-Branco, Senior Researcher, Future of Work at the Southern Center for Inequality Studies. A warm welcome to both our guests and thank you very much for joining us. Doc, let me start with you. When we talk about maybe the word business, or rather we mention the word business, what are we talking about essentially?
So for the informal economy, oftentimes the word business is used to refer to a wide range of activities, usually small and medium or micro enterprises, many of them registered, others unregistered, workers working informally in these enterprises, and sometimes workers working as direct employees. So it covers a wide range of activities, a wide range of statuses in terms of registration, a wide range of dynamics in terms of employment relationships within these.
Laura, is that what you find, especially with the work that you do when we speak about the informal economy and the sectors therein?
Yeah, I think this is a really important topic to think about because I think there's a lot of misunderstanding about what the informal economy is, what informal businesses are. We have, terms thrown out like informal business, informal sector, the informal economy. And I think it is important to understand that there are actually international definitions of the informal economy, the informal sector, and informal enterprises. And we've had those definitions for around 25 years laid out by the International Labour Organization. So yes, what Ruth describes is right. There's huge diversity in the informal economy. And within that subset, but we can't reduce the informal economy only to informal businesses, right? We need to understand that the informal economy includes both businesses, but also informal workers. And the output that those groups together produce, right? So there's a difference, and domestic worker working at home, in a home, and she doesn't have UIS, she's not registered by her employer, she's an informal worker as well, right? She's an informal waged worker in a household. The informal sector, of course, refers to the businesses. And there I think we also have to understand that there are different types of business. Because, you can have an informal business where somebody is an employer, pretty well off, employs other people. But you can also have informal businesses that are one woman selling sweets on the side of a street, right. On the roadside. And so we need to understand that diversity. And I think the other thing we also have to understand is the role that gender plays in that as well, because women tend to be the ones concentrated in these more fragile enterprises.
We'll get into that in a few moments. But Doc, when we speak of the informal business, right, and informal workers, from the work that you do, are there common threads, right? Yes, the African continent is quite big, it's very nuanced, it's quite vast. But are there common threads when we take a look at the sector, when we take a look at the workers within the sector? What can we draw that are parallels?
I think that there's quite a range. So on the one hand, you have cases where you have workers that are informally employed, but where there's some kind of clear employment relationship. And an example of this, for instance, would be domestic workers that in many parts of the African continent are considered informal workers because they don't benefit from the sort of standard employment relations that in South Africa in the post-apartheid period were extended to domestic workers. Then you have workers that are in what we'd call disguised employment relationships. So here we're talking often about workers on platforms is a good example. In the e-hailing sector, for instance, you have Uber drivers and drivers for other companies, Bolt, etc., that are defined as independent contractors, but who are effectively dependent on the app in order to make a living. They have very little autonomy over their labor and thus are effectively in an employment relationship, but in one where the employer, the app, is absolved of any responsibility for complying with labor and social protections. And then you have a third group, which across the African continent, I think is a bigger group, who are people who are self-employed. They have relative autonomy over their labor. They may even own the means of production. They can decide sort of how and when and what kind of work they do. And within this group, the primary sort of sector outside of South Africa is agriculture. Actually, it's agricultural workers. And the reason that so many countries are able to sustain such high levels of informality is because there's a much fairer distribution of land, and people are able to, through their access to land, to kind of eke out a livelihood from own agricultural production. And then, of course, you have trading, artisanal work, etc., which account for smaller but still significant elements within this self-employed category. Obviously, in South Africa, given the history of apartheid, the history of mass land dispossession, the group that's sort of small agricultural production is very, very small, and the bulk of the informal sector is then taken up by petty traders, as well as artisanal workers and so on. So I would say that there's a sort of a broad dimension of workers within the informal sector, and that then shapes the kinds of policy responses and responses from business that are possible and that are strategic. One really has to look at kind of the diversity of needs.
Right. Laura, Doc speaks of the policy responses. When you take a look at the policy responses from the countries that you deal with, right, on the continent, how would you characterize them? Because for some people, when you mention informal workers, it's quite negative, or it has a negative connotation. And so what are the policy responses that are there and available to informal workers?
So, I think this issue of the informal economy being seen negatively, perhaps I can just address that first, because I think it is really important. Often the informal economy is kind of conflated with the hidden, the underground, the illegal, or the shadow economy, right? And the two are actually not synonymous. They are different things. The vast majority of informal workers in the world are sort of just honestly trying to make a living under quite difficult circumstances. I think we also need to understand, I know that in South Africa, for example, there's a huge idea that the informal economy is all about tax evasion, right? So, and that is true for a minority of the informal economy, right? About 3% of informal workers fall into the category of employers. And those are the people who probably would fall within a tax net, but are not paying tax, right? Then you've got 97% of other workers who probably are earning too little to pay tax anyway. So, I think that's something I just wanted to address before talking about the policy responses, because the policy, as Ruth says, the policy responses have to depend on which part of the informal economy you are looking at supporting. And for one example, in Latin America is a sort of part of the world where they've done a fair amount try and reach informal enterprises with policy responses. And I think what we found that works is not so much the type of tax and register compliance approach, but more of a supportive approach, right, where there are incentives for informal enterprises to register and to pay their taxes. So in Latin America, for example, there's this idea of the mono-tax system, where there's a tax and a social security payment that is made in one easy payment, administratively simple. For paying their tax, the workers can see very clear benefits for what they're getting. Usually there's something around healthcare and pension, some kind of occupational benefits. And that's, those are the kinds of responses which are more likely to yield a positive response. So I think that's how government needs to think about it, and that's particularly for the types of workers and the types of enterprises that are the one woman stand on the side of the road.
Right.
Getting her, sort of trying to force her to comply with SARS and registering with the Companies Commission and so on is not going to work.
Yeah.
So that thing of the sticks and carrots, yes, we need to comply with things, but we also need to see why we should do that this makes sense for us.
Absolutely. Because then also there's the issue of harassment, right, from the relevant law enforcement authorities, especially for the one women shops that you will find, for lack of a better word, on the side of the road. Dr. Castel Branco, when we speak of compliance, does that then suggest that the sector needs to be formalized? As we hear, right, it's very nuanced, but that which should it be formalized? And what does formalization look like?
I think that's a good question and a tricky one, because formalization as a term is interpreted differently by, different actors. I think in terms of the ILO approach, it involves several different steps. The first is that obviously there needs to be compliance with labor protections. And so, for instance, where employees are informally employed because employers don't want to take responsibility for providing the kinds of benefits, the wages, etc., that are stipulated within the labor law, there needs to simply be enforcement of that. There's also a question about how to regulate disguised employment, and there's now a big debate around regulation of the platform economy. We have this huge sort of sector that has emerged, particularly since the COVID pandemic, that has transformed relations across various different occupations. And yet, because it's mediated by apps and apps are poorly regulated, they've been able to skirt labor and social protection. So, how is it, who are platform workers and actually what should they be entitled to? So that's obviously a question that has arisen. But obviously there's a third question, which is how do you create conditions for legitimately autonomous small, medium enterprises to thrive? I think that there are sort of various levels of action, from the national state and providing adequate infrastructure and public provisioning, to the local state and the municipalities, and ensuring that actually informal workers are able to operate, that there's access to markets and promotion of local production. One of the big challenges in South Africa is that you have the concentration of, for instance, the retail sector, where a small number of formal enterprises dominate all activity, the distribution of goods in particular sectors. And it's very, very difficult for smaller informal enterprises to break into this, right? Which is why things like the Competition Commission have been, those institutions have tried to think about how to promote other activities, how to promote the activities of small and medium enterprises, but it's quite difficult to do so. So I think that there's various levels within the state. And then, of course, there's also the private sector. And how is it that, informal production can be incorporated into the value chains, but also how is capital held to account in this process, right? And I think that these are complex questions that really have to be looked at by sector, by occupation, to try to understand the dynamics of production in particular areas. But there are, of course, some aspects that are transversal. And, I think that there's also a political dimension to this. I mean, we've seen in Mozambique in the last few months mass protests around the elections in Mozambique, but that are broadly, they're about other issues, in fact. They're about questions of unemployment, young people that are frustrated by the fact that they're not able to access basic services, housing, that they're not able to kind of thrive and lead independent lives. They feel that the skills that they've gained through education are being underutilized, that the incomes that they're receiving are inadequate. And there's a poster that went around that said, being an M-Pesa agent is not a job, right? And I think that a lot of the literature on the informal economy on the African continent tends to mystify the power of the informal economy without looking at the real challenges of people leading meaningful lives in various activities in these sectors that have to do with having an adequate income, having autonomy over their labor, and doing activities that are socially recognized. And so the big challenge is how can state and capital come together in order to respond to these that will have ramifications not only economically but also socially and politically.
When you speak of the intersection between state, capital and the informal worker, I think an example that comes to mind is a place like Yeoville, for instance. If you don't know Yeoville, it's a part of Johannesburg. It is bustling. You will find people from every corner of the continent there, right? And people have set up their informal businesses right outside of big business. So you will find certain retail sector that sells tomatoes, potatoes, mealie meal, if you will. And right outside their doorstep, guess what? When you walk out, you'll find a vendor that sells potatoes and tomatoes, but at a much more reasonable price. And some of that produce is of quality. So when you speak of having autonomy over your labor as an informal worker, that is quite important. Laura, what do the market women of Makola in Ghana, the market women of Yeovil, what is it that they experience, that they have in common, and what do they say? How do they feel? What are some of their voices from the work that you do? How do we amplify their voices? What do they want us to know?
So, I mean, I'm not speaking for the women
Sure.
traders in these places. They many of them are actually organized and speak quite effectively for themselves. But just in my experiences of working, say, both in Ghana and in South Africa, particularly in Durban, closely with traders, I mean, part of the problem, and we've alluded to this, part of the problem is the relationship with local government. So national government can have all the lovely small business development and, job creation sort of strategies at once. But the people who really control the working conditions of traders operating in public space are municipalities. And very often that relationship is punitive. Bylaws have tended not to see traders as workers. They've seen them as a sort of urban nuisance. That is how many bylaws in many cities operate. And local governments have also seen them as nuisances. And so everything is about punishing and restricting, and not about supporting and thinking, how do we actually enable incomes to thrive in this place? And, the inner city of Durban and Warwick Junction was a fantastic example of how the local government actually did try, through infrastructure development, through negotiations with trader organizations, to imagine what urban infrastructure in informal trading areas could look like, right? To improve income. So that thing about, what is the municipality enabling? What is the local government enabling through its bylaws and policies and the way it treats informal workers? So that's always a big one. And, Ruth has alluded to access to markets. I think that's also really important. I remember in the center of Ghana, at one point, the municipality had in a sort of rather outdated form of formalization, had tried to create a market for street vendors in the center of town in Kwame Nkrumah Circle. Mm-hmm. And they had moved the traders. They built beautiful stores for them, but they put a big wall around the trading space so that, Kwame Nkrumah Circle is a transport hub, like Warwick Junction in Durban. These are all transport hubs. So people, the traders make money because of the footfall of the passing traffic. People are changing, transport or arriving into the city for work, and they'll buy stuff. And so what the urban planners who designed the big wall around the market didn't realize was that they were now blocking the traders off from the footfall. So it was no surprise then to see that all the traders weren't using their stalls. They'd actually set up stalls outside the market walls.
Let's speak to the informal worker. What is it that you can tell them to give them that little bit of hope, to give them that sense of urgency, right, about their own lives, that you may not be where you want to be, but you on the right path you started?
Well, I think that, we saw this during the COVID pandemic, that in fact, many of the essential workers in our society, whether domestic workers, cleaners, healthcare professionals, retailers, etc., many essential workers are low-wage workers. And if we consider wages a way of valuing work and valuing people's contribution to society, then we see that there's a real disarticulation between the activities that matter for the life and human sustenance and how they are remunerated, how they are valued within our society. And so it makes sense that somebody who is earning a low wage, who is being treated as superfluous, whether by employers or by community members or by the government, whose activities are being repressed by the police or by others who want to impose social order, it makes sense that they would feel that this is not a job that they want to do. And I think that in our research, where we look at the social meaning of work, we see that social recognition is essential, and that social recognition is manifested through many sort of avenues, and one of them is income and sustenance. So when a young Mozambican person says selling M-Pesa is not a job, it's because they feel that it's not something that's going to put them on a pathway towards professional development. It's not something that's going to put them, that's going to use the skills that they have developed. It's not something that's articulated with what their dreams and aspirations are. It is ultimately a strategy of last resort. And I think, as researchers, we have a responsibility both to highlight the value, the incredible contribution that the informal economy makes in terms of the provision of goods, the provision of services, sources of income, essential activities to society and the social reproduction of society. But we have to somehow articulate that also with the broader aspirations, developmental aspirations. And that involves wrestling with real questions around, well, why is it that we've had economic stagnation? Why is it that we are having a process of deindustrialization? And what is it that we can do to turn that around? Why is it that actually public services have been in decline? Why is it that informal workers now have to pay for health costs, for education, higher expenditures for housing? And trying to bring together an analysis that both lifts up and values the informal economy, links that up with broader economic issues around industrial policy, and thinks seriously about the redistributive role of the state, not only through social grants, although those are important, but also through other more expansive forms of public provisioning.
Are we able to draw links between the informal economy and the GDP?
Yeah, so that's actually a really important question, because I think there's an idea that, when we're calculating GDP, that the informal economy isn't counted. But actually the informal economy is counted in GDP estimates. So most countries do capture most of the production from the informal sector and even informal employment in their GDP figures. What they don't do, and this is something that I think needs to be worked on, is separate out and calculate the portion of GDP that is generated from the informal economy. So we don't know in many cases the exact contribution that the informal economy is making to GDP. We just know that there's an aggregate figure. And for policy purposes, it is quite important that we separate these out. Mexico, for example, is one country where they do manage to separate out the contribution of the informal economy. So, that's perhaps, one thing that is important, and it's certainly, I know that for many organizations of workers in informal employment, the idea that we contribute through our labor, through our work, is an important way to raise esteem and to bring people together. And so I think it is important for us to understand the contribution of the informal economy to GDP. I know last year the IMF put out some estimates that in low and middle income countries, about 35% of GDP probably comes from the informal economy. I think that's not necessarily based on the gold standard method of working out the data, which is to use labor force surveys. But I think it gives a sense that the informal economy makes a significant contribution. We know in Mexico, which does use the gold standard, that about 23% of their gross value added comes from the informal sector, and the informal economy. So that's substantial. And so I think Ruth's point about, us really understanding that this is not just a bunch of tax evaders or survivalists. This is something real that needs to be built on. As Ruth talks about the need to reimagine our economies and reimagine change. It's not about eradicating the sector. It's about saying, well, how do we grow, how do we work with that to feed in to a sense of structural economic change and to move us forward.
Right.
So much of the, I was just reading The Economist this morning, so much of the debate is about, well, Africa needs to build big businesses. And I agree, Africa does need to build big businesses, but at the same time, some of those big businesses might come out of the informal economy.
Absolutely.
Who knows?
Absolutely.
So let's take it seriously.
And let's take a look at the metrics that we use, right, where we are concerned, and are they relevant? What's clear to me, I guess, from this conversation is that there's a lot of work to be done. You've sort of helped us lay the foundation, ladies, and thank you very much for taking part to help us understand about the sector that we clearly need to do more work and investigate. Laura Alphas, International Coordinator at Women in Informal Employment, Globalizing and Organizing, also known as WIEGO, as well as Dr. Ruth Castell-Branco, Senior Researcher, Future of Work at the Southern Center for Inequality Studies. And a big thank you to you for choosing the Business of Africa podcast. Do catch us again in the next fortnight, where we bring big and small business issues around the continent right to your doorstep. Bahaichu, Pula.